This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 34, The Rising Impact of the Gig Economy.
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, the rising impact of the gig economy. Now, it's not quite the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it's getting there. I'm talking about the dispute between London's black cab drivers and Uber. One is taking the homeland away from the other one, so there are similarities, aren't there, with the Arab-Israeli conflict? Black cab drivers, of course, defend that they're subject to a massive regulation that Uber drivers are not. It's the same argument that's happening in cities all around the world, and it's the same with Airbnb and the established accommodation industry. It's all part of the problem of the gig economy, and there's other ramifications too. Zero-hour contracts where people who might previously have been employed are being told to set themselves up as sole traders and work as suppliers to a company. Because again, it avoids the regulations associated with employing people. Now, Steve Keen, that's the big concern, I guess, isn't it, about the gig economy? It's a way of lowering costs while avoiding regulations, and we're seeing that time and time again.
Yeah, and what the real trouble is with the people who are providers in this, that they can't make a decent living out of it. And that seems to be the case, particularly with a lot of people working for Uber. Then it's an unsustainable model. It's a model which only works by churning at the level of the providers. Because after the providers go and find they actually aren't making any money out of it, and they'll leave and new ones come in. Yeah. And you have a market exploiting churn rather than a market being based on paying a decent wage.
There's always another fool who's prepared to try this for a while. Yeah, absolutely. Look, here's an interesting figure. The latest UK employment statistics to January 2017. The number of employees increased by 144,000. That's the number of people working for someone else. The number of self-employed increased by 148,000. In other words, the number of people who are working for themselves account for more than half of all new jobs. Now, it's people working for themselves are just 15% of the workforce now, but it could become very significant if that trend continues. So should we be worried about that?
Oh, there's positive elements to that as well as negative. I mean, you and I are both involved to some extent
we are,
in that market, and that's partly because you say, well, you don't want to work for a boss; you'd rather be working for yourself.
Well, no one wants me to work for them as well, to be totally honest with you.
Okay.
But I'd rather it was that way.
Yeah, that's the independent side of it, and of course that's very appealing. But of course, it means you therefore have to live on a very volatile income base, and if you're willing to cope with that, then fine, you can actually turn it into an overall market. So in that sense, you're being an entrepreneur. The trouble is a lot of people who are recorded as being self-employed, as you say, are working on zero-hour contracts where they actually are being made into sort of commercial subcontractees of a large organisation, which is doing very nicely out of it. So I'll give a personal example. I have a very good cleaner come in here once every 2 weeks. As it happens, I pay more for the web service that hired her than I pay her per hour.
Yeah.
Now you look at that and think, well, that is not exactly that is amplifying the inequality problem we know existed in the economy before the rise of the gig economy began. And again, it looks like something which is you would hope unsustainable, because you wouldn't want somebody to live on the wages that a cleaner gets in this country.
And yeah, these companies are doing very well for themselves, aren't they? They're listing as well on stock exchange and making their founders immensely rich on the back of, as you say, people who are getting paid a pittance.
Yeah, it'd be feasible if it was sustainable for both ends of the system, but if it's relying upon churn as the only source through which you get the staff that actually do the work, then it's only in the case of a failing overall job market will that actually function. So if you actually had genuine full employment taking place and people had a choice between working for an employer and working under the gig economy, they'd go for the employer. So it's really a case of saying, well, the gig economy only works because the rest of the economy is working very poorly. And that is not a healthy situation for either.
Yeah, because
component.
Because it is. Take your point. If the economy was healthier, maybe people would. It's a risk avoidance thing, isn't it? By the employers. Well, it's easier for us to reduce our risk if we don't employ people directly, so we'll take contractors. But it's also to do with regulation, isn't it? Which is where I started out. Because regulation is by and large is there to protect people. It's to ensure there's fairness and also to ensure there's competition, and also ensure nobody is left behind. Without it, we have a very divided society. And it sort of looks like that's what we're seeing right now, isn't it? We are seeing a very divided society, and at the same time, we're seeing people trying to flaunt that regulation because technology is the enabler behind this. If regulation changes because of that technology, it's easy to change the technology, less easy for a further response from the regulators. Technology is always going to be one step ahead.
That's one of the problems with Uber versus the taxi drivers, for example, because, of course, the classic thing in London, you have to have the knowledge to get a taxi license, which means that if you're asked a question about how to get from Waterloo Station to Prince Albert Hall, you have to be able to describe every last turn necessary to get an examination and say, right, you can be a taxi driver. Now, if you hop in an Uber vehicle, you see the little software package telling you where the car is, the driver where your passenger is, and what's the best route between the two locations, given not just the road network, but conditions on those roads as well. So that's a major disruptor. And if that came into the taxi industry, then of course the skill level needed to be a taxi driver would fall quite substantially. And you might imagine the taxi fares would fall as well. So it is something where if regulation is partly there to show you're not going to get a taxi driver who's also a part-time axe murderer, and you don't necessarily have the same controls over Uber, though you'd obviously want them. But it's also partly the technological lockdown that comes with a regulation approach only. So it is not one of those things where there's an easy solution.
Right.
There's parts of me that like what the gig economy has done, but I'd like them to be such that the people who worked in the gig economy got a living wage.
But isn't that fair
per
enough?
hour at least. Yeah.
But yeah, okay. Well, I want to lead on to that because I think that maybe is the conclusion to what we want to talk about today. But so don't get there too early, please, because we'll be finishing off this conversation 5 minutes early. But I think you've just touched on it. But let's go back to those. Let's go back to those cab drivers, because the situation you've described. What's wrong with that? Because a London cab driver, it's great that in the past they knew every single nook and cranny in Britain's capital, but now they just need to turn on a sat nav, so they don't really need to do the knowledge. We just need someone who knows how to use a sat nav, and so as you say, they can be less skilled, less qualified, and therefore we'd expect to pay less for it, and they'd make less money.
Yeah, and that's something which you would expect to have happen, and therefore people, in this particular case, you're going to come and say, well, the only reason the gig economy has expanded is because the price is too high, because the technology hasn't advanced sufficiently inside the industry, courtesy the regulations that mean the technology is not required to make the money. So it is one of those areas where a change in technology can completely change the landscape, and you want the regulators to respond. But of course, what they're doing is just not responding, and so the taxi drivers are going on strike on their own. And it is something where
they're going straight. Everyone will use Uber. And look, there was a federal court decision on this in the United States. It ruled in favour of ride-sharing firms like Uber. This was late last year. This was against the Chicago taxi industry, and I thought the judge summarised it very nicely. He said that it wasn't the businesses shouldn't be insulated from competition, no matter how disruptive. And they said instead of taxis, we might have horses and buggies. Instead of the telephone, we might have the telegraph. Instead of computers, slide rules. Obsolescence would equal entitlement. Couldn't have put it better myself. That's why these judges earn the big bucks.
But then what you want to have is say, okay, at the same time, you don't want to be based on unlimited exploitation of the staff who actually provide the labour in the gig economy. And therefore, the solution may be to say, well, if you're going to work for Uber has to have decent contract systems. So the minimum time that somebody can be expected to work for must be 4 hours, which used to be the old rule. Get rid of the zero contract arrangement. Yeah. And the minimum rate must be so many dollars per hour. If they get customers across that time, you might have a bit of risk sharing between the company and the employee, but at least give decent working conditions for the people in the Uber. And that would then, because that would fairly substantially increase the cost of Uber, internally for Uber, it might reduce the profit margins of the Uber shareholders. It'd still be advantageous, but I'm very happy to see the taxi industry disrupted by new technology. I'm not happy to see it disrupted by what amount to effectively slave wage payment rates in the gig economy, and that's the current trade-off we face. Right,
which we'll get to, which I think is the final point, which we'll delay for a second. But I think some sort of universal basic income is perhaps the answer behind all of this. But before we get there, the gig economy can I think, lead to much improved productivity. So I look at the way I work now, for example. I get paid for the work I do. I don't get paid. I've worked in large corporations, and I've got paid to hang around the water cooler, take a long lunch, and natter about what was on TV last night. I don't do any of that now because I want to try and make money for the hours I'm putting in. And I would have thought, if every company was outsourcing a great deal more and paying people for the work they produce rather than the hours that they turn in. And, those people similarly could perhaps work for several companies so long as there's not a conflict of interest. That's got to ultimately lead to greater productivity for businesses, hasn't it? And a better lifestyle for those people employed in that gig economy.
It depends on the type of industry you're talking about. I mean, if you simply can't go out there and design your own 747. So there are some areas where you want to have a corporate philosophy and where the getting together doesn't involve sitting around when you're around a cooler, you're thinking up new ways to build aerofoils. So there's creative elements to what looks like slagging off. It's more the internal bureaucratization of companies, at least the result that you're talking about there. And believe me, I've seen the same thing at universities. So this is one of the great questions in economics for some time in terms of conventional economics. According to conventional economics, they can't understand why firms exist. We should all be working as independent contractors, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, the reason that they do is often, first of all, the collective philosophy evolves, and therefore the corporation becomes a sort of unifying force of people's ambitions, and they work together in a way they'd never do with working as independent people charging each other. And then you also get the capability for design on a grand scale if those companies are well managed, where ideas come out of those corporate environments that would not necessarily have been generated by sole practitioners. And certainly the ideas couldn't even be put into practice. If you start looking at the level of capital investment needed to build a semiconductor plant, for example, you're talking billions. So you've got to have large organizations doing it.
And for those core functions, and in particular in research, I'd argue, though, even in research, there could be elements that could be contracted out. It's just you've just got to find an effective way of working. But it does seem likely, doesn't it, that companies are going to get sort of smaller and outsource more. That is going to be the trend going forwards.
Trouble is outsourcing is, again, one of these things which has a lot of appeals to it until you actually try doing it. So often the outsourcing means you don't have people say you should outsource things you're not an expert at. So for example, a university shouldn't be having its own computer staff. It should outsource the computing elements of its operations to a company that's more efficient. Often there are idiosyncratic things inside an organization which vitally need somebody who actually is on the ground and technologically capable in that area. I've seen lots of hassles caused by companies which thought they could outsource their computing and finding, in fact, they don't have the knowledge to even interpret what's being sold to them. So you have to have a certain amount of intelligence on the inside. You can't outsource everything.
Like the Australian Bureau of Statistics outsourcing the computer delivery of the census last year.
That went well, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, but let's move on from that because clearly there's a balance. So you pointed to this, the idea. All of this, the idea of the gig economy, does sort of lend itself, doesn't it, to the idea of a universal basic income. We all get a certain amount of money. Perhaps we have a flat rate tax as well. That's going to simplify life. And I do whatever I can through the gig economy to supplement that income. If tax is a flat rate, it could even be collected by the apps that are facilitating a lot of this work. We could have a very efficient tax system behind all of it as well. This sort of fundamental shift could help facilitate this sort of economy if that is the way the world is moving. Yeah,
it does, because at the moment, if you go into the gig economy, it's because you can't get a job on the full-time economy. If you're taking up a gig economy, you're not getting into access to holiday pay, sick pay, pension, et cetera, et cetera. You're taking what you can get, and then when you get out there, you're basically being exploited by companies like Uber, which can pay you a trivial amount of money, and often in some cases you find yourself you're not actually not making any money at all. You'd be better off being on the dole. If you then had a universal basic income providing a floor that meant that if you're going to be attracted to work in the gig economy, it'd have to be worth your while, we might get a fairer distribution of income out of it, and also the flexibility we want between people having to be locked into a corporation, which may end up being a soulless thing they want to leave, and being out in the free world, being to some extent entrepreneurial. So this sort of basic income idea could underwrite genuine entrepreneurial behavior rather than the faux stuff we get right now.
Right, but on the downside, couldn't we be also subsidizing some of those businesses? Because in effect, we are paying the marginal rate. It's sort of like those companies can say, well, all we need to do is pay people just enough to supplement the income that they're already getting, rather than paying a full living wage for them. So it's sort of like
they're doing what they're doing right now. Again, from what I can tell from rates for Uber drivers, looks like they're paying close to zero in terms of the difference between the cost of those drivers actually being in the car and paying out all their costs and the revenue they get. So many are making the calculation they can't sustain it and they get out again. So we do need to have that floor higher. Right,
but if we introduce a universal basic income, and then businesses can say, well, okay, we just need to pay people just enough to supplement the income they've already got, rather than pay them a full living wage. Then every company is going to say, well, if you're doing that, we might as well do that as well. So all of a sudden, you're having this big shift of money where people are paying less because the public purse is paying more.
Yeah, I think it's if you've got a base income, it still has to be cost advantageous for anybody to go into that. If you're going to be spending your time to get attracted to go and work in Uber, if you already got a basic income which covered your fundamental cost of living, it'd only go to Uber if that would increase that margin. So I think that's not a problem.
Yeah, you've still got competition for your time. You're still going to go for wherever you're going to make the most money. Yeah, it's an interesting thought, isn't it? And actually one that we may just have to do because of the gig economy.
Yeah, it may force us into a basic income, which would be quite a strange outcome. But politics works in strange ways.
Yeah, and it could come on us very quickly. The world is shifting very quickly in terms of the world of work, as we've seen with the demonstration of the number of people who are now becoming self-employed. Interesting one to watch. Appreciate your time, Steve.
Thank you.
And Steve and I are definitely an example of the gig economy, aren't we? Putting up a podcast that you have to pay for. Goodness me. There's an example, I guess, of ideas that people do come up with to try and make a few bucks on the side. That's it for this edition of the Debunking Economics Podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll be back with Steve Keen again very soon.